Okay, good morning everyone, or good afternoon depending on your location, and welcome to today's webinar, Becoming a Triple Threat Seller, 3 Research-Backed Ideas for 2017. My name is Steve Jones, Vice President of Global Demand Marketing here at Corporate Visions, and I'll be moderating today's event. But before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so we can make today's event as interactive as possible for you. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface here. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You've joined the presentation using your computer speaker system by default, but if you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. You'll also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane on the control panel. Feel free to send in your questions at any time during today's event, and we'll go ahead and collect these and answer as many as we can during our Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Also, as a reminder, following the event, we'll be sending all attendees a recording of today's webcast within the next 24 to 48 hours or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Tim Riesterer, Chief Strategy Officer at Corporate Visions and co-author of the 3 Value Conversations. Tim, thanks so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on how to have a more successful 2017. Tim, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone. Since I haven't seen you all yet, this is the last chance to say Happy New Year. And part of the reason I want to do that is because we're trying to start the new year off right with 3 big ideas. And the 3 big ideas are each derived from one of the 3 value conversations that we talk about in the book. The thing I want to kind of just sort of start with today is this idea that learning should be seen as a journey, and learning should have a story when you're a salesperson. Too often, learning is often connected to your onboarding and your ramping and your this and your that. There's a set of, or a catalog of training courses that you take, and they seem kind of random and arbitrary and don't necessarily have a story that knits them together. When we wrote the 3 value conversations, we had identified that there were 3 major outcomes that salespeople had to achieve and be great at and master. The first was you needed to build great pipe. Nothing happens if you don't create enough pipe. And you do that by breaking down the status quo and getting people to consider changing and then differentiating yourself from all the alternatives. So you have to create enough value to create qualified pipe. That's the first value conversation. The second value conversation is the idea that you then need to elevate that value. You need to build proposals that pass muster with executive business and financial buyers. That means building a business case that justifies the budget and an executive decision. The third thing you must master and be great at in your learning journey or learning story is the need to then capture that value. Don't let it leak out. And expanding the deal and protecting margins and avoiding unnecessary discounting to improve the profitability of your deals. So with the nice alliteration here, pipe, propose, and profit, we tell a little learning story for salespeople that you must be great in all 3 phases. And we call that the triple threat. And the reason we call that the triple threat is in show business, you have to be able to act, sing, and dance to be great. That's how you improve your performance and the ability to get hired and make millions of dollars and win lots of awards. And triple threat is embodied in Gene Kelly and Debbie Reynolds on the left, and I don't know, these 2 modern people on the right, but La La Land is going to win all kinds of Academy Awards with, you know, the triple threat in Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling. But I'm old school. I still don't think they hold a candle to the other triple threat here on the left, but I digress. So the idea of the triple threat, or the idea that you need to master 3 specific skill sets that all have major outcomes on your ability to develop pipe, close deals, and do it profitably, is that also you need to think of that as having a set of competencies under each one. And what we've done as part of the 3 value conversations and at Corporate Visions, the triple threat system, is identify specific skills that must be mastered to competency in order to create value. Specific skills for competency to elevate value, and specific skills to achieve competency in capturing value. And what I want to do today for 2017 and 17 is give you one idea in each of these areas, one idea that we've backed with some research. And what do I mean by research? Our work at Corporate Visions is unique, I'd like to think, among the companies that do training out there. What you get when you get into most sales training is the product of what I like to call best practices. The idea that you identify a bunch of sellers and you determine which behaviors generate better outcomes, and then you say, these behaviors in this sales profile, this is the winner, and these behavior and these sales profiles, they're the losers. And what you want to do then is get the loser profiles to imitate the behaviors or practices of the winning profile. That's one way to look at this, but we think that's too seller-centric. In a world that needs to be more customer-centric, this is inherently seller-centric, seller behavior-centric. We also think this is backward-looking. Once you establish something as a best practice and now you try to imitate it, it's probably now the average practice, not the best practice, because it's been documented and now everybody's trying to follow it. So it's more of a backward-looking approach. And there's a challenge with it being culturally relevant. The way salespeople act in certain cultures doesn't necessarily work in other cultures. So what you're going to hear from me today is research-based competencies and ideas for you to improve yourself that are rooted in something different, not best practices imitation and not based on a seller profile, but rooted in decision-making science. The idea in decision-making science is that there's research done to look at the mind of the buyer, how the buyer decides to shape value and make choices, and these invisible forces at work in the mind of the buyer. And these manifest themselves in the sciences of neuroscience, social psychology, and behavioral economics, which I've sort of aggregated into this idea of decision-making science. So the three ideas I'm going to give you today have been tested and proven using audiences of buyers, not necessarily behaviors of sellers. And we think that improves things because you no longer are seller-centric, you're buyer-centric. You're no longer backward-looking, you've now got timeless ideas because the human brain and the way decisions are made move forward in time and are constantly something to be aware of. And it's got universal applicability because the mind is the mind, the brain is the brain, it's designed the same. And the way it functions at the subconscious, emotional, intuitive decision level, and as it flips to the analytical, logical, rational level, is just something the way the brain does. It works that way. And you can argue, does it work in this geography or this gender? It turns out it works the same way. And the argument that it doesn't is usually people trying to make a case, but the science would tell you that there's a lot of similarities in the way genders and geographies make decisions. So without further ado, let's get to the one big idea for creating value, and then I'll talk about one big idea for each of the other value conversations. One of the big issues that people always ask us and are received for the last decades is this idea that diagnostic questions, you must diagnose before you prescribe anything. And what is the role of diagnostic questions in selling? So we wanted to take a look at that and find out how important and where diagnostic questions should be placed in the conversation with a customer when you're trying to build some pipeline and stimulate some activity and create some real opportunities. So what I want to do is role play with you right now, recognizing you can't talk back to me. I might have to play your role and my role. But let's say you go into a customer and you open with a diagnostic question. So here's the scenario. Let's pretend that you're selling some automation, some sales automation. In particular, you're selling sales content automation, something that hosts sales content and distributes it to salespeople. So a marketing person might be buying this because they want to distribute their content to you, the salespeople. So now you're the seller in this case. You go in to ask a diagnostic question. And your question is rooted in some industry knowledge that you have. And that is that, lo and behold, it turns out salespeople don't use all the content that marketing creates for them. I'm sure you are simply mortified by that fact right now, but it turns out to be true. So you could go in saying, there's recognition in the industry that salespeople don't use all the content that marketing creates for them. So I'm curious if you've calculated or have an idea, Mr. or Mrs. CMO, how much of your content is going used or unused in the organization. And what happens is they'll give you an answer. And I think you could argue that there's really two answers that could happen here. One, they might not know, so they might get a little defensive that you're asking them something they don't know and you're now asking them to take a guess. And the second would be they're probably going to lowball you because it's better to save a little face in this case. So they're going to say, you know, we're not perfect. I'm never going to say we're perfect. So I'm going to say in our company, probably a good 20% goes unused. It's probably like the 80-20 rule, right? Good fallback. 80% gets used, 20% unused. So now you have your answer to your open-ended diagnostic question. I want you to imagine for a second that you went in and approached this differently. You walked in and you said, according to some industry research by two different organizations, the American Marketing Association and Serious Decisions, on average, they report 70% of the content that marketing creates for salespeople goes unused in the field. So I'd like to know, where do you think you guys stand? How do you think you stack up against this number? What do you think is going to happen at this point? What's going to happen at this point, more than likely, is that they're going to give you maybe a little bit higher answer, because now that you've given them a number to set a bar, they're going to not, they're not going to say they've nailed this. They're going to say, you know what, we're not perfect, but we're probably not doing as well as we should either. So I'm going to say maybe 50%. That's just, that's a guess as to what they would answer, but it's more than likely they'll answer somewhere in that range, because what they're willing to do is be able to answer that they're better than everybody else, but yet they still might be broken. They're still not perfect. And here's why this is really important. Look at these two different outcomes. Now I want to give you a chart to show you how this kind of looks in real life and what's going on there. If you think about asking them with an open-ended diagnostic question to tell you where they are struggling, you let them anchor that number, and it now becomes just that. It becomes the anchor in your conversation. And then let's say you follow up with your statistic and say, well, I'm sorry, not follow up. And now let's compare that. If you lead with your statistic, now all of a sudden the number you shared in that stat becomes the anchor from which the rest of the discussion follows. So here's the difference. When you ask them to tell you where they're struggling, now you got to try and bring them up and into more pain in order to feel the need to change and possibly buy your software. Here's the risk in trying to bring them up. Let's say you ask how big is the problem, and then afterward you say, wow, that's interesting, you only say 20%. Industry statistics say it's 70 to 90%. Now you got a problem, because they're at that point going to be either defensive, like, are you calling me a liar? Are you saying that I lowballed you? And they start to argue your numbers and try and defend their position. You put them in a defensive spot if you share the insight after the question. And also, the bigger problem you might have is they'd be like, oh, wow, then I guess we're doing pretty good. And you don't have a problem, or they don't have a problem that they want or need you to solve. But if you think about what happens when you share the insight first and you anchor a higher number and they give you a little bit higher number, it gives them permission to say that they're better than other people. It gives them the opportunity to save face, but they get to admit the need at the same time. And what I would call, or what I want you to sort of take away is there's something called the anchoring effect. I don't think maybe that's new to the audience, but you never thought of it relative to the idea of diagnostic questions. And that diagnostic questions, which have been used for decades now, are no longer a differentiator. And in fact, they can probably work against you. And if you're starting to move in more of an insights-based selling environment, you've probably asked yourself, should I share my insight before or after the diagnostic question? And I would tell you that we believe and speculate you should answer it or ask it, share the insight first, and then ask the questions. But we never like speculating, and we never like guessing, and we never like just having an opinion. So we put this to the test. So we worked with our research partner, Dr. Zach Tormala. He's a persuasion expert at the university at Stanford Graduate Business School, and he built a test, and we worked this thing together. And let me show you the results of the test. When you share the insight and then ask diagnostic questions, people's confidence level in their current approach drops by over 7%. This is a statistically significant material drop in confidence. If you ask the question first and they give you an answer and then you share the insight, they're more confident in their current approach. So if the desire is to convince somebody they maybe need to leave their status quo, the need is for them to believe they have less confidence in their current approach. And you can do that better simply by sharing the insight and then asking the diagnostic questions and ask how they rank themselves relative to that insight, versus asking the questions first and allowing them to anchor you to the lower number and then have more confidence going into the sales conversation. People are more willing to admit they're not doing as well as they could when you share the insight first. We then measured the impact of the message, the rest of the story, when people were put in a position of hearing the new and improved options, right? So imagine the story was insight first, then questions, and then you heard some options to fix the problem, versus the other one was questions first, and then insights, and then you heard the options to solve the problem. And we created a third condition where we took an audience in and we just told them about some new things that were available to solve this problem. We never did the insight or the questions. That's the information only condition on the left. Then you have the questions with the insight following in the middle, and you have the insight or information and then the questions on the right. Interesting finding. There was no statistical, while small, it was not statistically significant in terms of people's, the impact of the message, meaning their interest level in these new features and benefits was no different statistically if you just introduced the features and benefits or you introduced it after the questions. But you see a statistically significant increase in the persuasive power of your message, your follow-on message, when you add the insight first and then ask the questions after. In other words, you see our conclusion there. The only way questions add value in the sales conversation is if they come after the insight. You can increase the persuasive power of the rest of your story when the person hears the insight, answers the question, and then hears your story, as opposed to answers the question, here's the insight, and then here's the rest of your story. And that position where you open with diagnostic questions has no more statistical impact on persuasion than just the information-only position. So what we're saying is that if you want to create value in 2017, break people from their status quo and create more qualified opportunities in pipeline, you must introduce insights before the questions to take maximum advantage of the anchoring effect that creates a decrease in confidence among your prospects in their current approach. So that's big idea number one. And that's how the rest of this is going to roll. I'm going to give you one example in each of these, and we'll be sending these slides out, like I said before. But this is the big idea for 2017 in creating more pipe, is to lead with insights before the diagnostic question, take advantage of the anchoring effect by decreasing their confidence in their current approach and improving your chances that they'll be more persuaded to change to something different. In the 3 value conversations, the next step is elevating value, taking that interest level and creating interest where the person is willing to make a business decision and put it through a business case. And we've got one idea we want to share out of all these competencies with some new testing we did this year. And it comes to this around this idea of telling a business impact story. How will you create and tell a story in your conversations with customers that demonstrates the business impact in a way that causes them to be more persuaded? And this is where our hypothesis was, and then I'll share the test with you in a little bit. The idea is that many people share their solutions in a vacuum. You say, here's the new and improved solution. Here's what we can do for you tomorrow. Here's the benefit of that. Here's the value. Here's the upside you're going to receive. But it's missing something. And that something that is missing is called contrast. The problem with that is that people find it hard to make a decision without contrast. The part of the brain you're aiming at for your story actually requires contrast to make a decision. And where does that contrast come from? When you're showing a new and improved way of doing things, it's by comparing and contrasting it to their current way of doing things. And in that contrast is where somebody actually sees the value of your solution. If you introduce your new and improved features and benefits, and then tell a story of value that those will provide, it's actually impossible for the brain to perceive that value because it's got to compare it to something. It's got to contrast it with something. So while it may be interesting, and yes, that may be beneficial, the natural human tendency is to think, well, that's not that different from what I'm already doing. So it actually requires you to elevate the value for the company, to show the business change, to show the risks involved with the current state, the limitations, the missed opportunities, the gaps and challenges, and literally identify the current state approach and why it's got some flaws relative to trying to achieve their desired outcomes. And then contrast that with the future state, how you're resolving those specific risks, because it is in this contrast that people will perceive value. If you don't show the current state and you only show the future state recommendations, solutions, features, and benefits, there's no contrast. The other risk is you don't show enough contrast. And it's a risk to make a change, and people will not take a risk of change for too little contrast. The story must requires you to demonstrate material contrast between the way they're doing things today, the cost of staying the same, and the benefit of the change. And this, in scientific terms, is called the contrast effect. So the contrast effect's in place in all of our lives. We use contrast all the time to make decisions. We don't decide to do something different if we don't necessarily think that what we're doing today, by comparison, is not good enough. And we can do that very fast in our brains. We use the fastest part of our brain to run this contrast scenario. And sometimes in a larger deal with multiple decision makers, you just got to be more explicit, because they need, in fact, they probably don't even fully appreciate what their current state looks like. I always argue that they don't know all the decisions that have been made in the company, because sometimes you're talking to decision makers who weren't part of the original decision. Maybe they don't fully grasp all the nuances of how that thing is working. In fact, the way it's working today may be a bunch of kludged together decisions over years that now the current state's more like Frankenstein's monster than anything sort of simple and streamlined. So it's hard for them to understand their current state. You, because you see many companies like them doing stuff similar, can come in and create a scenario that says many companies like you are doing things like this. Let me show you where the struggles, the failure points, the missed opportunities are, and how we resolve them. And in doing so, you actually do them a favor by giving them something to react to as opposed to just guess about. But of course, we had to put this to the test. We wanted to know if the contrast effect had a real impact in selling situations. So we created a selling situation again with Dr. Tormala and put hundreds of people through this to the point of making a decision to find out what affected their decision more. And what we have, as you'll see in this example, is we tested 4 conditions. The future only, where we shared the new and improved features and benefits and asked them to make a decision, or 3 contrasting conditions. One contrasting condition, they heard about the current state on the same screen, top, and then the future state, bottom. In the second condition, as you move to the right, it says separate screens. So we talked about the current state on one screen, then they heard about the new idea, new state, future state improvements on the second screen. And then in the last condition, they saw the current state on the left and the future state on the right, so they could do some side-by-side comparison. And what we found is that contrast has a significant impact on people's perceptions in a number of areas. In this case right here, what you see is that you can gain a 13.5% improvement in people's perception that your new product is innovative if you put it in a contrast position versus just sharing the new and improved. What it says is people themselves cannot appreciate how new and how improved your features and benefits are until it's put in a contrast position so they can go, oh, that's what I'm working with now. And now all of a sudden there's a significant uptick in their belief that you have something that is innovative and a clear improvement. The 3 bars on the right say it really doesn't matter exactly how you present the contrast. It just says present the contrast, because there was a statistically significant improvement in all 3. There was just a nudge better improvement on the last case where it's side by side, current state, future state. Bottom line, share contrast, significantly increase the perception that you're bringing an innovation to the table. No contrast, the perception that you're bringing something different and innovative declines significantly. Now, it's not just the perceptions you want them to choose. You want them to have attitudes that say, I'm willing to switch from what I'm doing, and in some cases willing to pay more for what you just showed me. When we asked the questions around this about the product we were promoting, there was a 14% increase in people's willingness to switch early and to pay more in the conditions that showed contrast. There was like a sense of urgency. Contrast created value, but also created a little bit of urgency, like, wow, there is a gap here. I am really missing out on something. Again, when you share a new and improved feature and benefit, you may have a few nerds, techies, wonks, or early adopters or visionaries who go, oh yeah, I'd like some of that new stuff. But the majority of your market isn't going to move until they see there's enough reason or enough contrast to move. So contrast is what drives the majority of your market. Now, the final question, purchase intention. After you read this and saw this, what's your likelihood of making the purchase? And in this case, we had created a fictional professional grade smartphone. And what we found, because we convinced the people in the study there was such a phone. So we took them right to the end to see if they'd be willing to make the purchase. And we increased the likelihood of making the purchase, the interest in taking that new phone, by almost 15% for those people who saw the story, heard the story in the contrast condition over the future benefits only. So it's our belief that if you want to elevate the value in the mind of the buyer, you must show them the contrast between the current state and the future state. And we use the scientific term and proven concept called the contrast effect to our advantage when you build a story like that. Now tested, now proven. So we give that to you as idea number 2 for 2017 of the 3 value conversations. Introduce and leverage the contrast effect by telling your story in the current state, future state, so you can visually help them see and feel the business change and the value of that change, the cost of staying the same and the benefit of the new. Big opportunity there. Third opportunity for 2017, so you can become the triple threat, is to work on the 3rd value conversation, the idea of capturing value, increasing the profits of your deals. So we got one idea that we'd like to share with you today based on some newer research that we've conducted. The idea here is avoiding the commodity trap. There's no doubt that pricing pressures continue to increase. There's no doubt that customers believe they know just about everything they need to know, and when they choose 3 vendors to talk to, they've created a specification that you're all asked to match, and when you can all match it, the only thing left to do is to beat you up on price. This is a funny thing. So thinking back to the contrast effect that I just told you about, people need contrast to make a decision. So when you come in looking just like your competitors because your buyers have forced you into that parity, that bake-off, as I like to say, they still need contrast to make the decision, and so price becomes the contrast. So the interesting thing about price is it's not really a budget thing. It's just that they need some contrast to make the decision, and they'd be stupid if they didn't choose the lower price. But that becomes the contrast they need to make the decision. So lo and behold, contrast is alive and well, even at this point in the buying cycle. Unfortunately, it's the price that becomes the contrast. So the problem is you're going into the sales conversation where the customer has all the certainty. What we've learned in the art of persuasion and negotiation is that your best tool is to introduce uncertainty, because your customer is coming to the conversation with certainty. Why is that? Because your customer has identified some needs and they've specified some requirements. You've gone in and you've repeated those needs back to the customer, and you've shown them how your capabilities meet the spec and respond to those requirements and needs. The problem is that commoditizes your conversation just like the customer wanted it. It puts you at parity with everybody they're looking at, so they can use the price lever for contrast. You panic a little bit, and so you're saying, well, here's how I'm going to fix that. We got to tell a story that introduces some capabilities that differentiates us, because if we're in this red box, it's clear we're not going to be able to get our price up. So you introduce some extra capabilities. You call them value-added services, and you hope that by introducing these differentiated extra capabilities, the customer goes, oh my, yes, I should pay you more. But the problem is, you've probably felt this personally, but there's actually science to back this up. They hear extra cost and extra complexity. They don't actually hear extra value services. They hear extra cost and extra complexity. They go, oh, well, that would explain why you're so much more expensive. You got all this extra stuff. And that extra stuff we may not need. So we're paying for something we don't need. And the problem is, extra things usually create potential failure points. You're going to make this harder, less user-friendly for all my people. So you introduce cost and complexity at the moment you think you're introducing extra value. So there's got to be a better way. So you need to interject pricing uncertainty somehow. And the way you interject pricing uncertainty isn't by adding capabilities and hoping to get paid more. You actually have to add needs, considerations, other things to the checklist. The way you introduce pricing uncertainty is to provoke or introduce additional needs and considerations that the customer hadn't thought of or hadn't spec'd, and get them to see that this is a need that they have to resolve, that it's got to be part of the dialogue. So that requires you to bring some interesting, surprising data to introduce an unconsidered need, something they hadn't thought of, and now they see it as a looming threat. Maybe it's a hidden problem they didn't know was there. Or maybe it's a problem they knew, but they didn't appreciate the size of. Or maybe it's a problem they're aware of, but they didn't think it was going to be that important right now. That was down the road. And you have to show them that, no, that problem's going to affect you sooner than later. And so the idea is that your job isn't to just be a tape recorder and identify the need, capture the needs that they identified. Because being a tape recorder means you're going to come back with a commoditized story. You actually have to be trusted advisor. And trusted advisor means you actually tell them something they didn't know about a problem or opportunity they didn't even know they had. And then and only then are they going to care about whether or not those capabilities exist, because now they have a need for them. This is called creating pricing uncertainty by introducing the unconsidered need and leveraging something in persuasion and negotiations called the uncertainty principle, that as long as the customer's certain, it's hard to persuade and it's hard to negotiate them up. You have to introduce uncertainty into that discussion in order to increase pricing flexibility. So one of the ways that this has been validated was a joint study that we did with a customer, in this case, a win-loss analysis. Looked at tens of millions of dollars of won and tens of millions of dollars of lost deals. And so we wanted to understand something, and here's what we found out. When we went back and asked customers in the loss analysis, why did we lose the deal? In this case, why did the client lose the deal? They found out they lost the deal because they were not price competitive. And of course, what the company we were working with said is, yeah, of course that's the case. We're always the high cost provider. We always lose on price. And it became sort of like we're never going to be able to compete if we don't offer a lower price conversation. But something interesting happened on the way to discovering why they won. And the number one criteria customer said is, you had the best price. In other words, we saw the most value. So now we had an issue. How can we win on price and lose on price? So they went back to the wins and they said, did we discount here? Did we sort of give away the company store to get this business? And it turned out they hadn't. They were getting more or less the margins they wanted to get on those deals. So the opportunity to win on price or perceived price and value existed somewhere deeper than the price dollar discount itself. And here's what they found. On average, when they lost, the customer was making the decision based on 2 to 3 specific needs or criteria they were trying to solve for. Versus when they won, it was based on 4 to 6 needs. So follow me. What happened was what? They had created some I'm going to go back to this picture. Sorry, folks. They had introduced some additional needs, considerations. They added to the checklist or criteria of the decision. And by doing so, they were able to solve for more things with more capabilities. And when they did that, lo and behold, they were able to win, but they were also able to win by the customer's perception. They were able to win on price. So here's the opportunity in this all-important end of the buying cycle where you want to make sure you maintain the profit of your deals. Introduce some unconsidered needs. Get past the identified, specified needs of the customer that link to the obvious specified capabilities, because your competitors are coming in responding to the same needs, probably with a similar set of capabilities because your portfolios aren't all that different, and now there's pricing certainty. You want to use the uncertainty principle to your advantage, and it's your job to create and interject that uncertainty, and the tool to use is to introduce and provoke into the conversation additional needs, criteria, or conditions to the checklist. And you do that not by introducing new capabilities. You do that by introducing new needs supported with supportable, defensible data that creates a surprise, that shows a need. That need is bigger than they thought, or it's coming sooner than they thought, or it revealed something that was hidden and makes it a part of the dialogue. So there you have it, 3 big ideas for the 3 value conversations for 2017. You can create more value, disrupt the status quo, and create more qualified pipe where people believe they're better than the number, but they're still broken enough to need fixing by using the anchoring effect and a specific tactic called insights before questions. You're going to improve the customer's ability to see the need to make the decision or see the value of making a decision when you take advantage of the contrast effect, introducing the current state and future state together so the customer sees the need to change. And you're going to capture more profitability and be able to protect your pricing and margins by using the uncertainty principle and interjecting unconsidered needs, additional needs to the checklist, to the criteria, so that you can introduce additional capabilities, expand the conversation, the deal size, and the opportunity to gain more margin. So that's the opportunity for this year, and I hope you'll be able to take advantage of any one or all of those 3 to become the triple threat. You can choose Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone, or you can choose Gene Kelly or Debbie Reynolds, but be able to create pipe, deliver proposals that pass muster, and protect your profits. So I appreciate your attention today. Here's a connection to some additional information that we're going to be happy to send you. There's a link here that you can use, a reminder that that's very specifically case sensitive. And we're talking in this white paper ebook about the trends in B2B sales training, and soon to be releasing a new ebook on the triple threat with these ideas and a couple more in it. Or go out and get the 3 value conversations. Steve, that's what I've got. Do we have any questions?
Thanks, Tim. That's great stuff. So yes, we're certainly now going to begin answering the questions that were submitted during the presentation today. And just as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in the attendee control panel, so feel free to do so now. Tim, here's our first question. How do these skills and the 3 value conversations approach in general compare to a sales process or a sales methodology?
So that's an astute, very nuanced question. Sales process and methodology I see as, here's the structure of how you manage an opportunity. Here are the steps you take to manage an opportunity from start to finish. Here are the milestones and toll gates, and here's the administrative practices, right, that a salesperson must follow so that the pipeline can be managed, can be interrogated, can be qualified. These ideas I see as a level of soft skills, that the process and methodology is about where you show up, who you talk to, what you do next. These ideas are about what you say when you actually get there. When you get them on the phone, get them on a webcast, or get in person. These are concepts, competencies, if you will, to have great conversations. process is process. It drives the administrative part, but it really doesn't help you improve the effort when your lips are moving. And that's an important make or break moment. And so these ideas are really tethered to this idea of the skill of the conversation when you show up and your lips must move, as opposed to the administrative requirement, which I think is necessary, of running someone through a process. So hopefully that separates it for the questioner a little bit.
Great, thanks, Tim. Next question here. How do you know which of the 3 value conversations is most important for your team?
So yeah, I think that's a great question. If you think of the idea of a triple threat, I got to be great at building pipe. I got to be really excellent at getting proposals that a business case that justifies budget, or I got to be really good at negotiations because I got to increase the profitability of my deals. Every company wants their salespeople to be great at all 3. Every salesperson wants to be great at all 3. The question is, which one first, right? Because it can look overwhelming. Really, there's one way to look at it is look at your CRM today and look at the data. And what you can find is if you or your team is lagging in pipe, you know what your close rates are. So you know how much pipe is needed to actually hit your number. So you can do the math pretty easily and run a report and say, these are the people struggling with pipe. They might need the create value competencies. So what I'm going to do for everybody is quickly go back, sorry for my desktop here, and just go back to the picture here so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Is that working, Steve? Can you see it now?
Yep, sure do.
Okay. So, you know, that, or let's say you can look at your CRM system and you can find the people who have a lot of stuck deals. They're stalled. There's no decision being taken. So proposals are going out, but they're not coming back in. I always call it the constipated pipeline. It's like stuck in the middle. I know that maybe is too graphic for people, but the idea, but it makes it memorable, right? You get a lot of proposals and you get a lot of traction, but somewhere along the way, you're clearly not getting the story told to the right person in the right way. And you can find that in your CRM system. Here's all the people with more than their fair share of stuck, stalled deals. So you can probably say this is the value conversation you need to work on the most. And you can also, through technology and analytics, find the salespeople who are indiscriminately discounting. And so one way a company can do this is by looking at their performance indicators, lagging pipeline, stall deals, or low margins on their deals, and start to say this is the area that should be a priority, and you can start to stack rank. But I'm going to say that probably in any company, you've got some in each bucket. So the idea would be don't train everybody on one thing. Ideally, maybe you train the groups on the thing that the performance indicator would tell you they're struggling. On another note, because we've created the 3 value conversations and built the competencies underneath it, we've also created a fluency assessment where we can do a behavioral outcome survey before, stack rank which of these value conversations appear to need the most help as we run their results against our baseline or benchmark. We can do that right down to this competency level and show you which competency you need to work on the most within which value conversation you need to work on the most. So there are a couple ways: performance indicators contained in your CRM system, a fluency assessment based on the competency map to discover where their gaps are. But there are ways of determining it so it isn't biting it all off at one time.
Perfect. Thanks, Tim. Next question here. Regarding message, impact, and insights, what are some approaches to get a prospect to meet with you, open an email, take a call, etc.? How do you encourage them to take a call from you on this? Yeah, so
we've got other research that I didn't share today, and it's available. It's out there. Sorry, I'm gonna jump around again, and I know there might be a more elegant way to do it, and real PowerPoint aficionados are going, "Oh my gosh, Riesterer, you're killing me." But here's the thing that I think is interesting. Back to this slide here with the uncertainty principle. To open anyone up to the possibility of being persuaded, let alone opening the pricing, negotiating on improvement in pricing, unconsidered needs is still a great tactic. So telling somebody something they didn't know about a problem or opportunity they didn't know they had introduces uncertainty into the equation. And so in the beginning, not just the end, but even in the beginning, you can use the uncertainty principle and the unconsidered need and take the surprising piece of data and identify the unconsidered need, tell a story, and introduce some uncertainty to the current state. And you should be doing the same thing in your voicemails, your emails, your demand gen campaigns, because you should be consistent, right? What you start at the beginning, you can then finish at the end by increasing the spec list or the criteria in the decision. So I would say take this research, move it to the front of the sales cycle, and leverage it there as well. Tell somebody something they didn't know about, a problem or opportunity they didn't know they had. Introduce uncertainty to their status quo, and frankly, don't build your emails based on voice of the customer research. Voice of the customer research is like diagnostic questions. The customer tells you what they already know. So even though it's a problem for them, they're already certain they know something about it. It's the uncertainty that's required. So by going out and saying, hey, do you have you probably have a problem with this, they'd be like, no, duh. And the problem is you've actually resolved them to certainty, and by telling them what they already told you. So add value early by introducing uncertainty, because what we hear in the science is that the thing I know hasn't killed me. It's the thing I'm missing that might. And my biggest concern in terms of the brain and the way it makes decision is missing something that could put my survival at risk. That's how you have to open. Do not open answering the obvious stated need. Introduce a new one, add some value.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Next question here. How do you draw contrast without calling their own baby ugly? Is it simply using phrases or evidence such as, here's an example, typically in your business, players do X, Y, Z, and personalize it in that way, or are there some other tricks or approaches?
Yeah, so when you're in the sales conversation, the best way to do this is it's sort of like a backdoor credentialing of your company. And that is to draw a picture of the current state based on the companies that you have talked to and work with. Because here's the one thing your customer actually believes about you that we found through our research. They know you see more companies and decision makers that look like them than they do, because they're myopically, parochially focused on their business and all the inner workings and all the challenges and the political strife and all the stuff inside their company. And they're just trying to keep the wheels on. And they don't have a chance to really engage their competitors. And if they try to engage all the information in the market, it's too much. It's overwhelming. So you have a chance to come in and say, here's what we're seeing out there. We work with, name the number, 250 companies every year to look at this challenge. And here's kind of what we see the current situation most companies are in. Then you allow that company you're talking to say, well, that's not exactly us, or go, well, there's a good chance that's happening here too. But either way, you're engaging them. And so it's like the insight before questions. Your current state sets up an anchor and says, here's what we're seeing. We worked with a company that distributed pharmaceuticals to hospitals. And they were able to go into hospitals and say, here are all the places medication errors occur. And what they could do better than the hospital themselves is because they could see it from when the shipment came to the shipping dock or loading dock, when that medicine went all the way to the bedside and was administered. And the problem in hospitals is that crossed multiple departments, and the multiple departments had a hard time figuring out where the failure points might be, because they were all siloed. So this drug distributor could come in and present a much better picture of the, if you will, institutional problems, because they had a long view of it or a wide lens, more so than any individual department did, and they could add value. So the point is, you see more people look like your customer prospect than they do. Use that to your advantage. Put a straw man idea up there. Identify the typical gaps, failure points, risks, threats and challenges, or missed opportunities. Let them then respond and say, not exactly like that here. Oh, we fixed that one here a year ago, but these other 5, yeah. So that's the opportunity. You don't come in saying, this is what I know, you screwed up. You make them a voyeur into what their competitors and others are doing, and they'll thank you for it.
Thanks, Tim. A lot of great questions coming in here. Here's the next question. We find introducing industry insights is great for leads that are buying something new or don't have full context and are open to it. But for creating value or insights, how do you address the highly experienced buyer that is going to feel put off by introducing industry stats, insights, etc.? Repeat
that last part again. I just
Sure.
want to hear it again. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But for creating value slash insights, how do you address the highly experienced buyer that is going to feel put off by introducing industry stats or insights, et cetera?
Well, that's a great question. So here's the thing. If you are introducing industry stats and they're highly experienced, it's probably because they're reading the same stats already, and you're not surprising them. There's nothing fresh. There's nothing original, nothing exclusive as to what you're telling them. You're probably, as a company, ready for and probably required now that you need to bring something that they can't find somewhere else. So the problem I see with most companies is you're trying to surprise customers with the same stats as everybody else, your competitors, as well as adjacent companies. They're all quoting the same analyst firms. They're all quoting the same research companies and their data. And you're like, hey, look at this insight I've got. Well, it isn't an insight you've got. You're quoting an industry stat, and hopefully maybe you have a unique point of view on that data. But the problem is most people don't even take it that far. They introduce a stat hoping that's going to surprise somebody. But do you have a spin on it where the customer hadn't looked at it that way? What's sort of like the counterintuitive spin on that stat? But more than likely, once they hear the stat, and if they've heard it a million times, like I'll give you one right now. 57% of buyers believe they're 50% of the way done with the buying cycle before they engage a salesperson. That is quoted by everybody everywhere. I go to a conference for marketers, and I hear that stat quoted by more speakers than not. And you tune it out. You no longer hear the rest of what they have to say because you're like, really? That's pretty lazy. That's pretty lame. So the idea is, what can you do to create fresh, original, exclusive research? I mean, we do it as a company, right? We go partner with Stanford and we run studies and try to give the market something unique to chew on that they couldn't get anywhere else. Your companies have to actually start looking for that same opportunity. What kind of research can you do into the industry? Because you are a major presence in the industry. And if you do credible research and maybe you partner with someone to get that research done, it is now exclusive to you and must be cited as yours. And now you become a thought leader in that way, not by quoting everybody else's stats, but by bringing your own stats. So that's one way a customer may be like, oh, well, I hadn't heard that one before. That is adding value to me. So not enough time on this webcast to talk through that, but fresh, exclusive, original, research-based insights, probably the next step for you.
Great, thanks, Tim. And I think this next question kind of piggybacks on what you're talking about here. How do you handle a customer so certain they're doing things right inside their company where they've been using a best of breed there for 20 plus years?
So, personalities aside, right? I mean, there are just some people who are jerks, and you can try all your persuasive mojo, and there may be some instances where you've just got people who have an issue. They have a brand loyalty, right? I mean, I've seen circumstances where people ask me this question: we won the bake-off, but then some senior executive swarmed down and stopped the deal and gave it to a competitor. Why? Because they were like on some advisory board with that competitor. I mean, there are mitigating circumstances to why people can be just absolutely impenetrable. But it's a great question. I mean, I would say that if you can surprise them, that's the problem. They've just not been surprised. And if there's a way to, I'll give you one example. I called on a CMO on behalf of our company, and a CMO at a very large multi-billion-dollar company. I got through, and he said, "You got 30 seconds to tell me something I don't already know." He's like, "I'm pretty well read. I've heard a lot of pitches, so you got 30 seconds. Go." And literally, I had to fall back on something we had done exclusively. And he was like, literally, "Okay, I've never heard that one before. You got 5 minutes." So that's what I have to say at this point. It's the best I've got, is that there's got to be some sort of originality and surprise there, because at the end of the day, folks don't want to miss something. The biggest risk is they might be missing something, and they might think they know everything, and yet they don't. Maybe you can come up with a metaphor of like, yeah, people thought the earth was flat until this happened. I don't know. That was kind of facetious, guys. Don't go out there and be sarcastic. I don't have a great answer other than to sort of keep trying to surprise them with something original and fresh that creates a little bit of uncertainty, and do it with a smile as someone who is here. I'll give you a quick idea. Here's what I've learned in some of my research, that when you're trying to build rapport with someone and you don't have 20 years to do it like your competitor does in this case, they've been using the same people for 20 years, the only way you can build rapport that is fast and maybe can trump the long relationship that they had is by introducing them to a shared crisis, a shared threat, a shared challenge, and find out how they're trying to respond to that. Here's an industry issue that's very interesting, and we see it as causing this kind of concern inside of the 150,000 companies we work with. Curious as to how this has been affecting your ability to manage this situation. And don't do it like you're telling them their baby's ugly and that their incumbent sucks. Create a scenario where you come alongside them on the other side of the desk by making a little bit of sense of something going on, and sort of it's like a shared observation. And make sure you have an observation on that issue. But my idea would be get in the trenches with them. People become faster friends in the trenches of a crisis or a shared enemy, and maybe you have to invoke something like that. So there you go. There's one idea.
Thanks, Tim.
That's the next book.
Next question here. We sell insights for a living. Highly experienced health industry advisors, selling to C-level, SVP, and VP level. How do you use insights to sell services based on your unique insights?
Wow, this is like living in the Matrix. So you need insights to sell your insights. So one of the things is just make sure that you got the definition of insights right. Most people think insights are a surprising factoid or industry piece of data and some interesting provocative question. But the reality is that our formula for an insight is that there's a surprising piece of data that kind of gets the hair on somebody's neck to stand up. Then you must identify the flaw in somebody's current approach that this creates. So as a result of this data, it puts this at risk because most people are doing this and haven't thought about that. So you move into sort of, here's the flaw in most approaches. And then you have to move toward the idea that there is a contrasting alternative. There's potentially a better way to look at it. So I say surprising data to flawed approach to contrasting alternative. You put a bow around that, that's an insight. And so when you're sharing an insight with your customer, it's got to be, it's not necessarily the insight you're going to give them about their industry. It's the insight about what they're doing today, something they might be doing where you have a surprising piece of data. Hey, did you realize that 90% of clinicians only gather this much information or intelligence before they make a diagnostic decision, and the reality is there's 5 times that available at the touch of a button that could make them more certain and use the power of this or that. I'm making that one up on the fly, gang. But there's an idea that you know the insight is related to them, their business success, and their needs, not the insight you're going to help them with their industry. I hope that makes sense, because they're first trying to just make a decision about how they can do better before they then decide how they're going to do something better for their end user. Lots of times we like to go straight to their end user and tell them something smart, but the first things first, they need to understand how you're going to solve and make their business better. Hopefully that was useful. This would require much more dialogue. I'd encourage you to respond to our email we're going to send out, and if you want to have an offline dialogue about this and I could probe a little bit more, I'd be happy to do that.
Okay, well, we're at the top of the hour, Tim, and so it looks like we're going to go ahead and wrap things up here. So I just want to thank you, Tim, and thank everybody for attending today's webinar. As we mentioned earlier, if we were unable to get your question during the webinar itself, we'll do our best to answer each question individually after the event via email. So on behalf of myself and Tim, thanks for joining us today, and please have a great rest of your day. Thank you.